Krista, you've got community questions for us. Can
I
you start
do.
it out for us?
So Alexi asks, when you switch to a new project, how often do you resurrect old ideas? In other words, what is more common, saying, here is something I've been thinking about for years, or starting on a brand new idea?
Interesting.
Yes, that's an insightful question, actually.
Very.
What do you think, Mark?
My first instinct is that I try mentally to dismiss what I've done before so that I can go into a new space and do something new because of what potentially I could learn, which is a lot. That's my first instinct. I think when I really think about it, though, I probably I go back again and again, like to the well of what I've already done. And if there's water every time, I'm just going to keep going until it's dry. But I try really hard to move away from what I've done. I think that's maybe a psychological behavior instead of advice.
Because what's interesting is, the mechanics of what you're doing, whether it's in a game or a book or a project or whatever, the mechanics can be very different. Because I know that is something you care very much about, is this daring, bold mechanics of something. But what the sacred concept or the idea behind it is, I think, what's the resource in that well that you keep going back to. It's these depth of concepts that kind of gnaw at you, and I'm saying at you, but I mean any of us that are creative. There are these concepts that gnaw at us that we keep bringing into projects or resurrect into new projects, even if the mechanics of what we're doing is much different.
Yeah, I think for me, I guess what I get at is if I don't go into an unknown space or a space that's scary or new, then I don't feel like I'm really bringing my best creative self to the work, and it doesn't feel challenging enough for me to feel like I'm using my time well. And again, maybe that's just something I need to think about, but I feel almost dismissive of the concept of going back to what I've done before. I know that it's helpful. I know that there's a lot of knowledge that you can glean from for something new, but when you're building, like, you can do your research, and I think that's great. But when you actually go into the creative work, when you're making something, when you're building something, when you're assembling something, I feel like there has to be a willingness to go further than what you've experienced before for it to be truly creative. And that's maybe just my perspective.
Yeah, I think I heard the question a little differently. Because I agree with all that. I think what I heard was, when we switch gears to a new project, is that at that point something that we come up with then, or do we go back and revisit ideas that we never pursued? So if we have 5 game ideas and we make one of them, when that's done, do we go back to those other 4, or do those just lay on the heap and we go do something else?
I like heap laying, personally.
It's a whole different conversation.
Oh, sorry.
And I think for that take on the question, I usually feel like, we're going to go back and revisit these, or I'm going to go back and revisit these. I totally have quite fleshed out game ideas that, we didn't pursue because we pursued Unsettled. And, then we had other game ideas that we didn't pursue because now we're pursuing Spiritfire. And, in my head, I think, well, this is still a good idea that we'll go back to at some point. And I never really stop feeling like that usually. Like, I continue to feel like these old ideas are going to be pursued eventually. Like, they live in that mode in my head. But I think if I'm being honest, realistically, what ends up happening is I just slowly tear them apart and use them on the new things.
Almost cannibalizing them.
Mm-hmm.
You take them apart, and that mechanic that worked well, or that idea that worked well, fits into this.
Yeah, so I think portions of those ideas have found their way into Unsettled and into Spiritfire, and they're kind of just being repurposed. Mm-hmm. And eventually that thing just kind of, gets bled dry and infused over here.
I've started to think about work that I've started and not finished. I used to think of it as graveyard of ideas where these ideas just don't work out and they go to die. But now I see them as like gardens, and maybe that's a term I think I've heard a couple times, graveyards and gardens, where sometimes the concept isn't ripe yet. Like, it just isn't ready to come to fruition. And it needs to in a season. And sometimes it does just need to be buried. And so I think I think the concept of having things in this active, cultivated garden of ideas, and you just like, you can come back to that later. You sometimes can glean some of that and use it on the thing that you're working on.
Like
but
Tom's saying, you go out and you pick some of those pea pods and you add it to the recipe you're working on right now.
Yeah, if the recipe needs
Just
peas.
watch Mark's brain and try to work into the metaphor.
I was like, was it not
Crank,
clear in
crank,
the
crank,
garden?
crank, crank,
Taking
crank,
the beans. You couldn't use them if they weren't in the garden.
Exactly.
Good, thank you.
Exactly where I was
That's
going
what
with
I.
that.
That's
Well
what I
done.
like to hear.
That's exactly right, Lacey.
Perfect response. Krista, so for you, like, let's say when you're working on new characters for cards in Vindication or in Unsettled, do you look at other things that you've done and, oh, this one I could modify for this character, or do you just kind of start from scratch on those?
I feel like regardless of the project, regardless of like the genre, because I can work in multiple different genres and all the surface things look very different. But there is this, it feels like a well that these same themes kind of come back and feed all of the ideas. And it feels like I'm drawing from that. And even when I don't mean to, even when, I get an assignment for something that is, okay, these are these surface features that we need. It's like this well beneath kind of feeds that.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense because that's what's part of us, right? What are the core things that make us up that are going to influence our projects, whether we mean to or not?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a process of recognition. When you see it, you don't know it's going to be there until you see it arise in your own work, and then you can recognize it at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's probably different seasons of need too, as far as the well goes. Like, Diane and I were watching that Beatles documentary on Disney, and like they're in this sort of pressure cooker situation where it's like, we need 14 songs right now, and we have 2 weeks to make all these songs. And when, normally they probably would have come in the room and like noodled around and everyone has a bunch of new ideas to talk about. They instead were in this position where it was like, well, here's one I wrote when I was 13, that, and then they take that from there. And, so like the situation created a need to go to the well, to these things that have lived there. And
garden.
you don't always need to go to the garden, but sometimes you do.
Whatever you're feeding yourself will inform. Yes, as you go to the garden. Sometimes it's strawberries, sometimes it's jalapenos.
Sometimes you mix them together.
Yeah, that sounds good.
does,
Actually,
doesn't it?
not gonna lie.
So listen, in the Saturday market of creative
Of
thought,
ideas.
Yeah, but to get to the point of the question, I think what do you do? I think some of it is mood. Some of it is what you've been feeding yourself. Some of it is what's inspiring you at the moment. Jalapenos. I want spicy things today, so I'm going to start with something spicy. Instead
that shoulder thing again.
instead of something sweet. That's going to make the cut, isn't it?
Yes.
I have remorse and regret.
you wiggling your shoulders to the word sweet is going to be like, we're going to try to make that the main mark.
Justin, don't endanger
It'll
your
be in
job,
your
please.
video obituary.
Krista, who was this question from again?
It was from, let me see, Alexi.
Alexi, thank you. This was a really good question. I liked being able to think about it this way too. And what a good Saturday market of ideas metaphor we were able to come up with from it.
Agreed.